10 years ago, on a sunny Sunday in April, I found myself sitting in the light of this window playing a game of Crazy Eights with some teenagers. A few months prior, I had started working at this addictions treatment center out in the Ghost Wilderness, only about 10 kilometers northeast of here. I was just starting to find my groove. I looked over at one of the young ladies on the couch who, up until that point, had been quietly reading her book, and I noticed tears streaming down her face. Immediately shifting from card-playing youth worker to concerned there's something wrong youth worker, I asked her if she was okay. And with a look in her eyes that was equal parts pain and curiosity, she asked me a question I'll never forget. "Jeff, is this what happiness feels like?" Now, aside from shaking me to the core with the realization that someone could make it to the age of 16 and first experience happiness at an addictions treatment program, this question sent me on a journey of interrogating some of the most basic truths of addiction and the helping profession. Central to this journey was this question: what is this thing called addiction? Here I was spending half my life out in the wilderness, and we were taking kids rock climbing and doing group psychotherapy, treating their addiction with casual conversations over dishes and formal sessions with a psychologist. And no one that I talked to was able to satisfactorily answer that question. And the logical questions that start to follow: what is addictions treatment? And why is the wilderness such a powerful component? Now, just out of curiosity, quick show of hands or nod your heads, who here would consider addiction to be a problem in society? And maybe you've had a close encounter yourself or a friend or a family. Maybe you've read about fentanyl overdoses every day for the past couple of years. It's perfectly reasonable for us to look at addiction and say, that's a problem, and we should do something about it. I'm here to suggest that today, addiction is not a problem. Addiction is actually a solution. And we need to start looking at it like that if we have any hopes with dealing with it. Before we get to addiction being a solution, we need to understand some of the different ways that we've conceptualized addiction in society. First is the addiction as choice model, and that addicts are somehow morally weak, lack willpower, and if they would just pick themselves up by their bootstraps, things would be better. This conveniently takes the burden and the blame and places it squarely on the people suffering the most, the addicts. Thankfully, about 40 years ago, psychologists came out with a new definition of addiction, characterizing it as a disease, like tuberculosis or Alzheimer's. This was certainly a move in the right direction. It reduced the stigma of addiction, and more people would be inclined to seek treatment. Unfortunately, widespread enthusiasm for this disease model has caused us to overlook the fact that addiction has very little in common with diseases. There's no infectious agent, like in tuberculosis. There's no pathological biological process, like in diabetes. And there's no degenerative conditions, like in Alzheimer's or arthritis. In fact, the only thing that addiction has in common with diseases is that if you don't do something about it, it tends to get worse. Here's the American Society for Addiction Medicine's definition of addiction. Don't try and read it. I shrunk it down to 6-point font. It still takes up more than 3 slides. It's more than 2,000 words long, which is longer than most of the essays I wrote in high school. And central to this definition is this term: biopsychosocial spiritual. Like, what is that? Or what isn't that? Isn't that everything? Addiction starts to look like the everything in the kitchen sink disease, a convenient way to legitimize and organize addictions treatment into something that's done by professionals with advanced degrees in clinical settings, and more so with medication. And here we were, treating this so-called disease by carrying heavy packs around the forest, sitting around a campfire talking about our feelings, and learning how to trust each other and take risks on a high ropes course. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not going to pretend to be one here on the TED stage, but this struck me as fairly unusual treatment for a disease. Fast forward a couple of years, and I'm out on Vancouver Island doing a residency in a master's program, and I pop into Monroe's used bookstore. If you haven't been, it's wonderful. You should check it out. And I stumble across this book by Dr. Gabor Mate, who spent a lot of his career on the downtown east side of Vancouver working with the chronically homeless and addicted people that find their way there. Finally, something that started to explain addiction not as choice or as disease, but as a completely irrational response to someone's context that they find themselves in, to the experiences that they've had in their life that have led them there. In fact, it's a way to look at addiction not as pathological, but as a completely logical response to the distress and the pain that we find ourselves in. In fact, Dr. Mate says that the question we should be asking ourselves is not why the addiction, But why the pain? Turns out that most drugs of abuse are actually painkillers, from fentanyl to heroin to alcohol. And most of the behaviors and habits that we develop, from workaholism to shopping to compulsively checking our smartphones, as Ernest would point out, are attempts to relieve distress, relieve pain. I started to understand addiction and substance use on a continuum, not as black and white as we thought, not choice or disease, but as existing in the gray, with addiction and substance use disorder certainly on one end, but ceremonial uses, recreational, medicinal should probably make the list. Lots of different ways that we can understand substance use and habits in society. So it's at this point that I've developed a fairly solid theoretical understanding of addiction, or what I thought was addiction. And unbeknownst to me, I was a few short years away from taking this theory and testing it in the real world. In early 2011, I found myself getting in the night to pee a lot. Thirsty all the time, rapidly losing weight, and irritable. Yeah, you guessed it, diabetes. 28 years old, relatively fit, and a pancreas that had suddenly stopped producing the insulin like it should. Now, I could probably do an entire TED talk on how to scare the crap out of your healthcare professional by ignoring their advice and eating lots of bacon and butter to manage diabetes, but this is a talk on human nature, not nutrition. Being diagnosed with an actual disease forced me to look this other disease, this idea of addiction, squarely in the face. I realized that my tendency to open up the freezer and reach for the ice cream when I was stressed out about my thesis was the exact same biological mechanism that drives the alcoholic to reach for the bottle, the junkie to reach for the needle, and Ernest to reach for his smartphone. Addiction starts to look like actually just a glitch in the human operating system, as a biological mechanism left over from our evolutionary past that at one point served a really useful purpose, and it was now killing us. You see, there are essentially two things that we do as humans, and lots of the speakers have alluded to some of this, but we ease distress and we chase eustress. Distress are those cortisol and adrenaline, the fight-flight responses that distressing circumstances bring about. Eustress is the other side of that coin. It's the dopamine and the oxytocin and the serotonin that Ernest was talking about. Right? So these are the two things that we're constantly doing. We've got lots of different mechanisms for this, from taking a yoga class to a glass of red wine. Both of those ease distress. Going out climbing, paddling, skiing, all these things induce eustress. So does eating a healthy meal and having sex and doing lines of cocaine. And just as footsteps on a forest floor will eventually wear down a path, so too do our habitual coping mechanisms create pathways in the architecture and the wiring of our brain. When we find something that works, chances are high we're going to do that again. And again and again and again. It's called learning, something that we're particularly good at. And it turns out there are two different ways to ease distress and to chase eustress: functional and dysfunctional. A glass of red wine on a Friday night to deal with the stress of their week is a pretty functional way to unwind. It's when that glass turns into a bottle or two and every Friday night becomes every night, we call it alcoholism. And it's not actually alcoholism until you've got hangovers and liver failure and broken families. So it's not actually the substance that's the problem. The substance alleviates distress. It's a solution, a temporary solution for the distress that we're under. Same thing happens on the eustress side of the coin. In fact, you can take something as beautiful and abundant and natural as sunshine and take it to the extreme, and it becomes tanorexia, the addiction to tanning beds. All the things on that list can be functional and they can become dysfunctional. We would call these things below addiction, right, because of the consequences of that repetitive behavior. From maxing out our credit cards from compulsive shopping to checking our smartphone 100 times a day or touching it 2,600 times a day, to our more traditional ideas of drug and alcohol abuse, with this new paradigm, distress, eustress, we start to see addiction everywhere. And not as choice or disease, but as a logical response to the context we find ourselves in. The context that we've built around ourselves that is actually just filled with distress. We used to go days in the wilderness without running into big stressors, and when we did, they were acute. They were a bear or a saber-toothed tiger or a storm. something we could fight or flee from. Now we've built an environment around ourselves that's filled with chronic stress, traffic, mortgage payments, social media. In fact, I often find myself looking out into the crowd looking for the non-addicts and having trouble finding them, outside of very young children. You surround yourself with enough distress and the development of habitual coping mechanisms seems to become inevitable. In his book, Chasing the Scream, author Johann Hari spent 2 years going around the world looking at addiction. And he writes about some of the early research on addiction that involved taking rats and putting them into cages by themselves, offering them water, and water laced with cocaine. Not surprisingly, the rats preferred the cocaine. It wasn't until a few years later that a Canadian researcher, Dr. Bruce Alexander, replicated those studies with an important twist that we began to see the true nature of addiction. He created this place called Rat Park, where rats were free to socialize and engage with each other, being true to their nature. And in that environment, none of the rats used the cocaine, none of them became addicted, and none of them died of overdoses. Turns out that addiction has nothing to do with the cocaine and everything to do with the cage. So I'm going to invite you into a challenge over the next couple of days, not today, because your brains are going to be full, but over the next couple of days, reflect on some of the habits, behaviors, or substance use in your own life. And ask yourself, how does this make sense in the context that I find myself in? How does this make sense as a response to distress? Chances are high that you've been spending more time at your desk doing this than sitting around the campfire. More time mindlessly going from work to dance class to soccer practice than purposefully going nowhere. More time feeling lost in this chaotic and uncertain world instead of actually being lost, if only in your thoughts and if only for a moment. It's only recently that I begin to feel myself getting closer to the answer to that elusive question. What is this thing called addiction? Suddenly that experience that I had on the couch 10 years ago with that young lady crying at the discovery of happiness makes so much sense. She had opened the door to her cage. It turns out that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Connection to ourselves, connection to each other, connection to the world around us, connection to the true power of our human nature, the power to create habits that will ultimately destroy us, habits that we'll call addiction, or the power to create habits that get us a little bit closer to eustress a little more often and with fewer side effects. Suddenly the answer to that question, what is addiction's treatment, becomes much more clear. And it doesn't surprise me that taking kids out of their cages and out into the wilderness, reconnecting them with nature and with themselves and with other people would have such tremendous effects. It doesn't surprise me that trading our cages for a taste of the open air would be such a powerful way to heal. What surprises me is that most of us don't do the same. Thank you very much.